kind of animal could come in and do this to her?
We didn't have a whole lot of evidence. It's scarier when there's no motives.
We're sick psychopaths that get pleasure of killing other people.
Have you ever been so inspired by a movie that you wanted to reproduce it in real life? Well, hopefully it wasn't a horror movie.
Elements of Scream are all there, and it's all happening to Cassie Jo.
There are some people out there who are so disturbed they thought nothing of recreating the 1996 horror movie Scream inside the house of a 16-year-old girl. In fact, they had fun terrorizing Cassie Jo Stoddard while she was all alone house-sitting for her aunt and uncle.
What kind of animal could come in and do this to her? What kind of person were we going to be finding during the investigation?
Well, the answer would be pretty shocking, as would the crime scene Cassie's aunt would find. Trigger warning, today we'll be discussing themes of extreme violence and very graphic crime scenes. Pretty much every detail in this story is outrageous and upsetting. But if you're ready for it, let's dive into the case of the teens who killed their friend after being inspired by Scream. On December 21st, 1989, Cassie Jo Stoddard's story began in a little town called Pocatello, Idaho. This is a Mormon town where not much happens. The families are peaceful, everyone knows each other, and kids can play in the streets whenever they like. Cassie's parents broke up when she was quite young, and she and her brother grew up with their grandparents. Cassie loved animals more than anything, and her goal was to go to university and become a lawyer.
All the information we ever received concerning Cassie was that she was a good person, she was a good student, and she was just, genuinely kind to everyone.
She truly was. At school, she had lots of friends, and people were genuinely happy to see her.
Hey, look, it's Cassie.
Hey, look, I don't know.
Hello, Cassie.
This video was recorded on Friday, September 22nd, 2006. After school, Cassie was supposed to head to her aunt's home and house sit for the weekend. Her aunt, Allison, and uncle were away, and they had 3 cats and 2 dogs, and of course, a big house that needed tending to. This was also an opportunity for Cassie to make a little bit of cash. Throughout the previous summer, she'd done a lot of babysitting and house sitting, as she was saving up to buy her own car. So on the evening of Friday, September 22nd, Cassie's mom drove her over to the Whispering Cliffs Drive. Creepy enough, right? Well, that's where Aunt Allison lived. Cassie's mom left her at the house, handed her the keys, and took off. Now Cassie was all alone in this huge house. But it wouldn't be for long, because Cassie had a boyfriend. She and Matt had been dating for about 4 months, and Cassie had asked her aunt if Matt could come over one evening. Allison knew Cassie for the straight-A, responsible person that she was, so she wasn't worried Cassie would trash her house or throw a massive party. She said, of course, Matt can come every day if he wants to. What could be greater at 16 than spending the weekend all alone with your boyfriend in a giant house full of animals and no parents? So within an hour, Matt was at the house, and he and Cassie made some popcorn and put on a movie.
We were there alone for a while, and so we started watching TV.
But within another hour, 2 more boys showed up.
Ryan, Tori, how you doing, man? Hey, man.
This didn't sit well with Cassie. Matt never asked her if it was okay to bring more people, and she didn't know them that well. Plus, this was Allison's house, not hers. For Matt, it didn't sound like that much of a deal. Ryan Draper and Tori Admick were his schoolmates, and when they texted Matt asking him to hang out with them, he just told them to come to where he was. But to Cassie's delight, the 2 boys found the young couple's movie watching very dull. So soon enough, they were out. They told Matt they were going to see a movie downtown, and they left the house. Now Cassie was alone with Matt again, and everything felt perfect. Except in just a few minutes, her reality would turn to hell. Cassie and Matt continued to cuddle and watch the movie when the power went out.
According to Matt, around 10 p.m., the power goes out, plunging the house into darkness.
Cassie was pretty scared. The whole house was completely dark and barely any light was coming from the street. She didn't know what had happened, and she didn't know how to fix it. Matt tried to calm her down, saying these things happen, but little did he know they had just become part of a real-life horror movie.
I can't think of anything more cliche in a horror movie than the power going out. But you know what? It really did.
Matt then headed to the basement to pop the breaker and get the power back up. When he did, the power came back, but only partially. Still, Cassie was a bit distraught. So Matt called his mom asking if he could spend the night with Cassie so that he could comfort her, but his mom said definitely not. They were two 16-year-olds. She didn't trust them all alone in a half-dark house. She invited Cassie over, but Cassie said she'd promised Allison she'd watch her house and the animals. She couldn't just leave for the night. So around 10:30 p.m., Matt's mom arrived and picked up her son. Cassie stayed indoors and set out to finish her movie. She would make it a popcorn and movie night until she fell asleep on the sofa. Except she would never fall asleep again. That night, Cassie would lose her life in the most horrendous way imaginable. On the evening of Sunday, September 24th, Allison, her husband, and their 13-year-old daughter returned home. They hadn't heard from Cassie all weekend, so they assumed everything was fine. This was 2006. People didn't send pictures of their animals on smartphones all the time. But when Allison's daughter walked in, she screamed in horror and ran back out. Cassie was lying in a pool of blood. Within 10 minutes, the police were at the house.
Initially on the scene, we didn't have a whole lot of evidence.
The scene might have been tidy, but Cassie had been stabbed 29 times, so viciously that almost 10 of the wounds would have been fatal on their own. This was a shock to everyone who knew Cassie, let alone her family. Who had the motive to do such a gruesome act and take the life of a girl who never got herself in trouble? As her family was at a loss, so was the police. But the officers knew they had to retrace Cassie's steps that weekend. So first they found out Cassie had spent Friday evening with her boyfriend Matt. Soon enough, he was brought to the station for an interview. Now, there were a few suspicious things about Matt. On the one hand, he showed close to no emotion when the officers delivered the news about Cassie's death. It was almost as if he knew. And on the other hand, Matt's mom could corroborate that she picked him up at 10:30 p.m. and drove him home that night. But she couldn't tell whether Cassie was alive or not at that point. So Matt could have killed her before going home.
Obviously, he could be lying to us. Well, certainly the fact that he's leaving the house just before she is killed bothers me.
Ironically, the first suspect in the Scream movie was also the victim's boyfriend. After all, victims' partners are oftentimes their killers.
You have a copycat crime, but you also have these details which really do mirror the film.
Matt was given a polygraph test, and he passed. But he also told the police officers a vital piece of information. That Friday night, two other boys came to the house briefly, Brian Draper and Tori Adamick. That day, Brian and Tori were also brought over to the police station. They both told the same story. They'd come to Cassie's house for about an hour, then they left to watch a movie. And it turns out they had the ticket stubs to prove it too. The police were once again at a loss. If the last three people who saw Cassie alive had strong alibis for the night, who could have murdered her? But just before they let Brian and Tori go, the investigators had one last question for them.
Here they are in the interrogation, and they're just gonna ask one more question, something tough, something unexpected. You know what they ask? How was the movie?
I don't know, it's just it's a horror flick, man.
Neither of the boys could say anything about the film, not even its basic plot or a couple of characters. And there was something truly odd about this. Brian and Tori were huge movie buffs, particularly horror movies. They even made movies of their own. If you asked anyone at their school about Brian and Tori, they'd say, oh yeah, they're the movie gods. So, how come they couldn't say one thing about the movie they'd just seen a few days back?
It was 2 nights ago. You're a film guy.
What 16-year-old kid, I mean, we're talking the night before, doesn't remember what movie he went to? That's ludicrous. It's not gonna happen.
That's when Tori broke. But he didn't break down in tears, nor did he show any kind of remorse. He just said in a low voice, all right, we didn't go to the movies. I was lying, because I did something very bad. Both he and Brian eventually admitted they never went to a movie, but they didn't confess to what they actually did.
Here's where the story takes another turn. The boys separately indict themselves, but on a matter far less serious than what the police are investigating.
The boys claimed they broke into random cars for a couple of hours, but by 11 p.m. they were both home. That's not what happened. But trust me when I say, what Brian and Tori did to Cassie that night was truly the stuff of nightmares. As soon as Cassie was home alone that night, the power went out again. Come on. Then it would go on and off faster and faster. By now, it was clear to Cassie that someone was doing this to her. She was terrified, and she didn't know what to do. If she investigated, she might get hurt. But if she stood in one spot, she might get hurt too. She was simply frozen with fear. Meanwhile, in the dark, she would hear all sorts of noises coming from all around the house.
Both have masks on. He walks up and he tells me, you do something scary, it's gonna freak her out. And I'm like, okay. And so I grab a door and I open it and I slam it. And we just kind of go into the room and the crime happens.
Finally, a horrible masked person showed up right next to Cassie, just like in Scream. It wasn't just one masked psychopath, it was two of them, and they had Cassie cornered. She screamed in horror as she realized there was no way out for her. They pinned her to the ground and jabbed her 29 times. From them, this was just a fun reenactment of their favorite horror movie. How could a bunch of high school kids do this for fun? The officers would soon discover that Brian and Tori thought just like a bunch of high school kids. They didn't cover their tracks too well. It took just a few minutes to check if there had been any reports of car break-ins that weekend, and there weren't any. The investigators came to a terrible conclusion.
We did not want to believe that Brian and Tori could do this. But we couldn't ignore not only that they're lying to us, but they're lying to us at the exact time frame that we believe Cassie is killed.
But the boys wouldn't confess, even though the officers told them they were prime suspects in Cassie's murder. So, the police turned to the forensics team. With this information, the officers could put more pressure on the boys and let them know they can't make up a third lie as an alibi. Then the detective asked Tori about his knife collection, and he requested to speak to an attorney.
By law, we are required to not ask him any further questions at this point.
The police had to let the boys go for the night, but the very next morning, something truly odd happened. Yep, if you thought the worst part was over, guess again. When the detectives got to the police station that morning, Brian was already there, crying next to his parents. Clearly, Brian was ready to speak, so the detective invited him into the interrogation room again.
They had left Cassie's house. They had gone down around the corner, and both of them had taken out knives that they had purchased a while back. They went back to Cassie's house.
Brian told the officers how the two boys snuck into the house's basement, how they put on scary masks, and how they played with the power. But that it was just meant to be a prank, Brian said. According to him, it was Tori who impaled Cassie, and Brian just watched in horror. But it's easy to try and pin the blame on your partner in crime, right? The detectives just didn't believe him.
I certainly don't believe Brian's version. I believe that the two of them killed Cassie. I believe that they're both equally as involved in it as the other person.
Here's where the law gets tricky. The officers knew the boys were guilty. They even had a partial confession from Brian. But without any physical evidence, they couldn't convict either of them.
We knew that they'd already been in the house. So some of the evidence that we look for, hairs and fibers, fingerprints, DNA from fingerprints, those kind of things, they were going to be a moot point for us.
However, Allison's home was squeaky clean. Allison and her family were even staying at a hotel during the investigation. The police arranged for them to stay there for 2 weeks. They couldn't tamper with any evidence, and who would want to be in that house anyway? The officers couldn't find any relevant DNA inside the house. The boys were wearing gloves, masks, and hoods that night. But it was Brian once again who spoke. Apparently, he'd disposed of all of the evidence by putting it in a plastic trash bag and taking it to a woody area in the south part of Pocatello. Before long, Brian took the police to the area. This was everything the detectives needed to convict the two.
The boys stashed everything there. Masks, knives, one with a serrated blade, one with a straight blade.
But they also found one other thing that none of us expected to find, and that was a videotape.
Imagine being a cop and finding a tape of gruesome evidence. Would you be eager to watch it or completely terrified? Apparently, the whole team felt nauseous, and when they played the tape, there came another shock. The day before Cassie's murder, the boys were bragging about their plan and ranting about their very disturbing worldview.
Evil, the origin, is a follower of Satan.
There is no Satan.
Real? Then shut up.
Then how are we supposed to express ourselves?
Good and bad.
We're bad.
We're bad.
That sounds so
We're evil. That's not even
We're not, okay? They were sick psychopaths do not get pleasure of killing other people.
That sounds good, baby.
Not only do they now know what they are, but they took great pleasure in it too. How sick is this? Then the boys, enthused about replicating their favorite movie inside Cassie's home.
We're gonna be just like Scream, except real life terms.
That
We're gonna be
sounds good,
murderers.
baby.
Everything that was on that tape was simply horrendous. It was just hard to believe that these boys were 16 at the time.
Tori, September 20th, 2006. Brian is supposed to happen tonight. So hopefully everything will go wrong. Everything will go smoothly and we can get our first kill done. I'm sorry. I'm sorry, Cassie's family, but she had number one. He has to confirm. And she's perfect. She's gonna die.
This was Brian talking, the same Brian that had come to the police station crying next to his parents. How messed up do you have to be to make such a videotape and explain calmly to your victim's family that you're gonna kill their daughter? What's even creepier is that Brian had a huge crush on Cassie. He'd liked her for months, but Cassie was not interested in him. She only had eyes for his friend, Matt. Watching Brian speak so openly about murder shocked all of the officers who saw this tape.
I've been in law enforcement for 22 years now, and I have never in my life seen anything that can even come close to the videotape that we had in this case, and I'll probably never see it again.
You might say, sure, this is a small town in Idaho. How many horrible crimes do these officers see in a lifetime? But even for huge cities like New York or London, a couple of teenage kids reproducing Scream to perfection is unusual and horrifying.
We found our victim, and sad as it may be, she's our friend. But you know what? We all have to make sacrifices.
These boys didn't seem to have any sort of remorse or understanding of the gravity of murder.
What these videotapes really show are two individuals who are highly psychopathic.
She's gonna be alone in a big, dark house out in the middle of nowhere. How perfect can you get? I mean, like, holy dude.
I'm horny just thinking about it.
Hell yeah.
Sheesh. For days on tape, the boys hyped up this horrific event and fed off each other's enthusiasm. They also promised to keep killing girls from their school one by one, starting with Cassie and then moving on to all of her friends.
It's gonna be extra fun.
You're evil.
Yes, I am.
They have no conscience, or appear to have no conscience, lack of remorse. They get off on killing. And it really speaks to the fact that these are two mentally unstable individuals.
Brian and Tori's original plan involved taking Matt's life too. As far as they knew, Matt would stay with Cassie that evening and watch movies. They planned to sneak into the house, then make a noise outside so that Matt would come and investigate. That's when the boys would kill Matt and scare Cassie. Then they would continue to chase her through the house until they would finally stab her to death. When Matt left the house, he only made the job easier for them. 2 against 1 is never a fair fight. Apparently, when the two came over to Cassie's, Brian went to the bathroom. On his way, he unlocked the back door. When he came back into the living room, Tori stood up and the two left, seemingly to go to the movies. In fact, they just circled back to the house, but not without videotaping this first.
Unfortunately, we have the grueling task of killing our 2 friends. And they are right in that house just down the street.
We just talked to them. We were there for an hour. But
we checked out the whole house. We know there's lots of doors. There's lots of places to hide. I unlocked the back doors, so it's all unlocked.
It's really sad to think about how Cassie Jo Stoddart lived her last hour, alone, scared, in the dark, not knowing what was happening. Who was doing this to her and why? To know you were always kind to those around you and now you're being repaid like this must be really upsetting.
I think what haunts me about the case is just the last few moments or minutes of Cassie's life. And where my heart hurts for her is how painful it was and how scared she must have been right before she lost her life.
Perhaps what makes this case even sadder is how much fun these two psychopathic monsters had. After leaving Cassie in a pool of blood, they left the house and continued to videotape themselves. This time, they were proud.
Just killed Cassie. We just left her house. This is not a joke. I her in the throat and I saw her lifeless body just disappear. Dude, I just killed Cassie.
Although very hard to watch, this tape was just what the police needed to see the boys in prison. The trial wasn't a difficult one from a logistical point of view. The prosecution had a really damning videotape, but it was difficult from an emotional point of view. Hundreds of Pocatello residents came just to try and understand why the boys behaved like monsters. What was their story? When did they become psychopathic killers? Unfortunately, even this bit mirrored Scream. The boys didn't have any motive.
End of Scream, Billy and Stu are revealed to be the killers. And they're asked, what's the motive? We don't need a motive. Hannibal Lecter didn't have a motive. Norman Bates didn't have a motive. Like Billy says, it's scarier when there's no motives.
It's true. Murder is the worst thing ever. But when it's done for the sheer pleasure of it, it's somehow made even worse. And this is why Cassie's family might never get the closure they need so badly.
So we might not know exactly why Brian and Tori killed Cassie and Joe, but we might begin to think that they committed this murder for a sense of fame, for a sense of notoriety.
I've always wanted to make a mark on the world, so this is a good way to do it.
After all, they did make the front pages everywhere. The high school kids who copied Scream and killed an innocent girl in the dark. It's sad and wrong that Tori and Brian got what they wanted.
What we got to see with Brian and Tori was just how evil they really are.
And to paint a complete picture, this video was taken by them.
Hey, look, it's Cassie.
Hey, look,
Hello, Cassie.
Yep, they filmed Cassie and even had a little chat with her on the morning of the day that they would take her life.
Wait, have you seen Tori? He's supposed to be here at 7:30, and it's 8:19. He's an hour late. You don't even care, dude. Okay. See ya.
Brian knew he was about to kill Cassie, and yet he was acting friendly with her, abusing her trust and kindness in a really sickening way. On August 24th, 2007, both killers were sentenced to life in prison for first-degree murder and an additional 30 years to life for conspiracy to commit murder. While this might not have brought peace to the hearts of Cassie's family, justice had been done, and they knew Brian and Tori would never leave prison.
It felt really good to be able to look at the family and have them look at you back knowing that all of the hard work that was involved in this case paid off.
Outrageously, Tori appealed his sentence, saying that he never actually admitted to stabbing Cassie, not during the police interrogations nor on the videotapes. It was Brian doing most of the talking, and Tori was just reacting to Brian's ideas. Then both boys appealed their sentences, saying that there were faults with the search warrants that police handed to their parents to search their homes. Their appeals were all denied. But imagine how upsetting it was for Cassie's family to see that even now, Brian and Tori would not take responsibility for what they did. So just how responsible was Scream for what happened to Cassie?
Don't blame the movies, Sid. That's what Skeet Ulrich says. Movies don't create psychos. Movies just make psychos more creative.
You'll often see psychopathic killers blaming violent movies, music, or video games for their unspeakable actions. But you're responsible for your own actions. There's a big difference between an artistic creation that shows violence and a violent act in real life. People should learn to own up to it. But did Brian and Tori ever own up to their horrible crime? In 2013, they made headlines again when they appeared in a documentary. This was done after a law was passed in Idaho, making life imprisonment without parole unconstitutional for all juveniles. The boys had a pretty different stance now.
I thought that I was a nobody at my high school, and I wanted to be known. And So I tried all these different identities, and I couldn't, find an identity that I could not be pushed out of, I guess. So I got into Columbine.
Brian spoke about how he became obsessed with the Columbine shooting and got it into his head that he was an underdog, just like the Columbine shooters felt they were. Things only got worse for him when his crush started dating his friend, Matt.
I was attracted to her, and I thought she was a special person. But she started going out with this other kid I knew in high school, and it kind of struck me hard, and I was like, okay, so, I am a loser.
Then he met Tori, who was really into horror movies. Tori suggested they copy Scream, and Brian went along, feeling less alone now that he had a partner in crime. Tori, on the other hand, still claims his innocence to this day. That's right. He says he was high during the videotapes and that he never laid a finger on Cassie. Even worse, during the documentary interview, he sits right next to his parents and complains about how he lost his freedom.
I think it's crazy how the last week of me being on the street, being free, really has affected the rest of my life. If you were to watch that video and nothing had happened, it would literally be a joke.
Even his mom claimed her son is wrongfully imprisoned. Of course, she wants her son to be home with her, but is this right for Cassie and her family? What about all the other people Brian and Tori had promised to kill? Would they be safe from someone who doesn't take responsibility even years and years later? Cassie's horrific murder affected her whole family. After finding her cousin dead in her own home, Allison's daughter fell into severe depression, and so did her mother. Allison even lost her job because she couldn't focus anymore. Desperate, the family tried to sell their house and start afresh, but no one wanted to buy that haunted place. Cassie's parents, grandparents, and everyone who loved her are still grieving and trying hard to move past the horrific crime. They have started a charity called Pumpkins for Cassie, where they donate to children's and animal shelters. Through the charity, they try to remember Cassie, not as the victim of a horrible, terrifying attack, but as the kind animal lover who always had a warm smile to give. Still, it's a very sad thought that at least one of her two killers isn't ready to admit his guilt.
911 emergency.
Yes, I have a missing child.
93 to ambulance, 93 to fire department. Respond to Oasis Park, southwest of the pond.
I don't trust who he is with, is my problem.
How long's he been missing?
About 3 hours.
This is Craig Sorger, and these are his two friends, Evan Savoy and Jake Eakin. But look closer. Would you want these two boys to be your friends? There's something a little off about them. Like, they're not your average, playful 12-year-old boys. Unfortunately, Craig Sorger and his family would find out the awful truth about Jake and Evan the hard way. In 2003, Jake and Evan became the youngest people to be tried as adults in the state of Washington. They'd pretended to be Craig's friends, all the while hiding a vile hatred for those weaker than them. What they did to poor Craig is unspeakable. But how did two 12-year-old boys reach such a low point? And were their sentences enough to bring justice for Craig? Watch on, but be warned. We'll be discussing the themes of extreme violence, torture, the death of children, and abortion. Yep, this is gonna be a pretty tough case. But if you're ready, let's dive in. Today's story begins in a place called Everett in Washington State. Everett is home to over 100,000 people, and it's just 25 miles away from Seattle. But it has some pretty big issues. Its crime rate is 56% higher than the national average in the US. People rarely walk alone at night, and store owners are always on edge, worrying about their property getting vandalized. A gas stop even ironically put up a sign saying, "Welcome to Tweakerville." Everett has been ranked as one of the worst places to live in Washington. But life was happy and peaceful for Craig Sorger, at least in the beginning. He was born on February 10th, 1990, and grew up with his parents Lisa and Chuck, and his younger brother Keith. But when he was a toddler, Craig's parents started noticing some strange behaviors in their son. Worried about what that might mean, they took him to a doctor. Soon enough, it was discovered that Craig was on the autistic spectrum. This wasn't bad news. In fact, discovering this early on meant that Craig had all the extra care that he needed, both at home and at school. Craig was a special education student, but he did well in school, apart from sports. His physical coordination wasn't that great. At home, he had a great relationship with his parents. He just found it a little hard to do certain tasks. One such thing was changing scenery. Indeed, Craig was very resistant to change of any sort, from food to clothing, let alone moving house. When he was 11 years old, Craig moved with his family to a tiny town called Ephrata. It's a really small place, home to around 8,000 people. 30 years ago, there was just around 6,000, and there really wasn't that much to do. But Craig was okay with that. He rarely socialized with anyone apart from his parents and brother. In fact, Keith was his best friend, and that was about it. And since the move to a new town took quite a big toll on him, Craig was even less social now. He spent most of his time playing video games, fooling around outside his home, or helping his dad, who was a car mechanic, with his work. Craig had an engineer's mind, and he was already starting to show great talent. According to Lisa, he could fix a VCR's lights in a few seconds, and he was better than his parents at operating computers and installing video games. Craig's parents just couldn't wait to see their son's career blossom. They were certain he was going to achieve greatness. But just 5 days after his 13th birthday, Craig's life would come to a tragic halt. On February 15th, 2003, Craig was enjoying an afternoon at home. That's when Lisa heard a knock on the door. She wasn't expecting anyone, but she opened up anyway. It was two boys, Evan Savoy and Jake Eakin. They were Craig's age. In fact, they were a few months younger. Lisa had never seen them before, but Keith had. Apparently, they would sometimes play with Craig while he was outside his home or in the local park. And this is exactly what they had come to do now. Evan and Jake asked Lisa if her son was around. They said they'd like to take Craig and play at the Oasis Park, an RV park just a few blocks down. Jake and Evan had been best friends since they were 2 years old. People rarely saw them apart, and many thought that they were brothers. But there was something odd about their dynamic. Jake really looked up to Evan and was proud to say that they were best buds. But if you asked Evan, he'd say Jake is his step friend. That's because he thought Jake was one step below him. Indeed, Jake was a shy boy who often copied Evan's behavior but dealt with some unaddressed anger issues. Evan, on the other hand, was the class clown who was desperate to be the center of attention everywhere he went. This included his school. This was the same special education school that Craig attended. So the boys were surprised to see Lisa so reluctant to let Craig play with them. But she simply didn't know them. Craig hadn't spoken about them, and there was something else. The weather was dreadful, and Craig had just recovered from a cold. Lisa was just about to close the door and send the boys home when she turned around and saw Craig, beaming with hope. This was the first time someone invited him to play with them. He felt like he had friends, and he was really excited about going out with them. Lisa saw this, and she understood this was very important for her son. So she said okay, but urged the boys to come back within an hour or so. She had to go run some errands, and it was getting dark soon. Jake and Evan thanked Lisa, grabbed Craig, and off they went. Before heading out the door, Craig hugged his mom, grateful for her accepting nature. Lisa was happy too. For once, her son appeared to have friends outside his family. But she was giddy with anticipation. She wanted to hear all about Craig's playdate, and she wanted to complete her errands before dark. So minutes felt like hours to her. Imagine how she felt when her son wasn't back home and the sun was about to set. Not only was this an inconvenience to her schedule, she was terribly worried. Craig was afraid of the dark, and he wouldn't stay out all night of his own will. So Lisa grabbed her coat and rushed to Oasis Park, but none of the boys were there. So Lisa figured Craig must have gone to one of the boys' homes. Maybe they were playing video games or eating with their families. But when Lisa got to Evan's home, her heart sank. Evan and Jake were playing video games and looked completely relaxed. When she asked them about Craig, they said, "Oh, we haven't seen him for hours." Apparently they parted ways at the park, like she said, after about an hour. Then they went to Evan's home and never saw Craig again. With trembling hands, Lisa dialed 911.
911 emergency. Yes, I have a missing child.
Active freight ambulance, freight fire department, respond to Oasis Park, southwest of the pond.
I don't trust who he is with, is my problem.
How long's he been missing?
About 3 hours.
She told the dispatcher that her son is on the autistic spectrum and that he struggled outside on his own. He was very vulnerable wherever he was. The police knew this too, so they immediately started a search throughout Ephrata. Lisa joined the team to search around the neighborhood, and even Evan and his family helped. The search didn't take long. The officers headed off to Oasis Park, covering its every alley, particularly those Craig was afraid of, the dark, secluded trails in the back. Tragically, this was exactly where Craig lost his life. Lisa found her son lying face down in a red pool under a tree. He was pronounced dead at the scene. There were a lot of people at the crime scene. 12 police officers, Lisa, Evan, Jake, their families, and pretty much anyone who'd realized what was happening. Lisa touched her son's body and felt he was still warm. He'd only been dead an hour or two. She stood up crying and pointed towards Evan. Evan just shrugged, as if he was surprised to hear this silly accusation. Needless to say, his parents strongly denied Lisa's allegation and told her to calm down. How could their 12-year-old boy commit such a heinous act? And Evan and Jake's statement was clear. They played for a little bit, then they parted ways. Whatever happened next was out of their control. But as the police took Evan to the station, his statement became less clear. Now he was saying Craig actually fell from a tree. Apparently they played football and tackle tag, and then they climbed the trees. And when Craig fell and hit his head, he didn't know what to do, so he went home. Evan's mom, Holly, was right next to him during the interrogation, as this is allowed for any underage suspect. Holly was listening to her son's account, but he looked at him while he was talking. At one point, she realized he'd changed his shoes after coming home from the park. She didn't bring this up right then and there, but she didn't forget the detail. The next day, Holly was doing the laundry. Inside the bathroom, she noticed that Evan had washed his park shoes. They were still wet, hidden behind the laundry basket. When she spoke to her husband about it, he also noticed Evan was missing his new sweatshirt. He'd left home wearing it and came home without it, so that evening, Evan's parents sat him down and demanded an explanation for this. Evan broke down crying and told his parents that he hadn't been telling the whole truth. Craig had fallen from a really high branch and cracked his head pretty badly. Evan rushed over to check for a pulse, but he somehow got covered in a lot of blood. Then he realized Craig was dead. In a panic, Evan washed his shoes in a nearby pond and buried his sweatshirt in a muddy place so as not to get in trouble with the police. He was scared he would have to go to jail for something he didn't do. Holly and Evan's stepfather were shocked to hear this story. They didn't even know whether to believe their son or if he was hiding something else. Holly rang the police and told them what Evan had told her. The officers invited her to the station and asked her to bring his shoes as well. Now the investigators knew if they asked Evan to tell his story again, he might just repeat it word for word. So to see if he was telling the truth, they went to Jake's house and questioned him. Jake said that the three of them climbed a tree and Craig fell down and hit his head. But Evan had said only Craig was up in the tree. There were some inconsistencies. Meanwhile, the police dug up Evan's bloody sweatshirt from the pond. And that day, an autopsy was conducted on Craig's body. Sure enough, the results didn't say fell from a tree. Craig had been viciously hurt and stabbed. He had 34 jabs in his head and neck alone, and a few others in the chest. It was so vicious that the tip of the weapon was still buried in Craig's skull. His death was a slow, painful, and terrifying one. He lived his last moments wondering what he had done to deserve this, and why his two friends killed him. The police immediately arrested Jake and Evan. They were held on $1 million bail each. By far a record-setting sum for a 12-year-old. Imagine the waves this news made in a tiny town like Ephrata. Not even the biggest cities in the world are used to 12-year-old murderers. But even if Jake and Evan were in custody now, they remained adamant that they had nothing to do with Craig's death. They only fled the scene because they panicked, and they would be held accountable for Craig's silly fall, they said. Even when they were shown the autopsy results. Outrageously enough, the boys' families even created a theory where after the boys fled the scene, somebody else found Craig's body and desecrated it. The police couldn't exclude any theory, but they were pretty sure the boys were guilty. They just needed to find enough evidence to convict them. This was just the beginning of a tiresome process that scarred the Sorger family more than it brought closure. As in many cases, the investigators spend a great deal of time learning about the suspects' lives at home. Who were Jake and Evan? And what would give them the motive to do something so horribly wrong? At a first glance, there was simply nothing out of the ordinary about the boys. As far as everyone knew, they were two schoolboys with special needs who enjoyed violent video games and playtime outside their house. Evan and Jake were interviewed by several psychologists. Jake had an IQ of 93 and the language and writing skills of a 7-year-old, but from a behavioral point of view, he was deemed completely normal. Evan scored average on just about everything. Dr. Eric Johnson concluded that both boys are well enough mentally to be rehabilitated. He thus suggested to the judge that they be tried as juveniles. Indeed, this debate lasted for a while. The psychologists argued that in juvenile prison, the boys would learn to reintegrate into society. They would also be freed when they turned 21, which meant that they would get a chance at normal careers. Needless to say, the boys' families were pushing hard for this, but the judge had another piece of information. Both boys had clothes with blood on them, and the blood matched Craig's DNA. So, he decided to try them both as adults. Evan and Jake thus became the youngest people to ever be tried as adults in Washington State and the US alike. Both the boys would be in juvenile detention for 2 years until the state would allow this trial to continue. And by 2005, Jake changed his story. Now he told investigators that the 3 boys were in the park together when he left to go get some soda. When he got back, Evan was brutally attacking Craig. Then he threw his sweatshirt and something else in the nearby pond. A forensics team was immediately sent to the pond, and before long they retrieved Evan's murder weapon, the knife with the broken tip. The knife had been in the murky waters for 2 years, so fingerprints couldn't be analyzed. But the broken tip perfectly completed the knife, and that was good enough evidence. But Jake's confession wasn't good enough. It sounded like a classic case of throwing your friend under the bus. So the investigators put a lot of psychological pressure on Jake until he finally cracked. On February 15th, 1990, Jake and Evan were playing in Oasis Park, but Evan had a bigger plan. He was a bully, and he was used to preying on the most vulnerable. So he showed Jake a knife he had on him and suggested that they kill Craig along with the owner of a trailer court. He discovered the term killing spree recently, and he wanted to become a mass murderer. Evan was Jake's best friend and brother from another mother. He didn't think twice about joining him. So the 2 friends went over to Craig's house and convinced Lisa to let her son go play with them. When they got to the park, Evan asked Craig to feel the ground to see if it was wet. Then he told Craig to touch the ground and count to 10. Poor Craig followed his friend's instructions. While he was focusing on the ground below him, Evan grabbed a huge rock and dropped it on Craig's neck. Then he pulled out the knife from his pocket and proceeded to stab him and kick him with his feet. At first, Jake yelled at Evan to stop, but when he tried to pull him away, Evan threw him to the ground. His weight twice as much as Jake, so Jake gave up. Meanwhile, Craig was screaming and asking Evan why he was doing this. Craig got up and ran away 3 times, but Evan kept dragging him back to the ground, stabbing him some more. After watching the horror show for a couple of minutes, Jake decided to participate as well. In fact, he told the cops that initially he picked up a stick with the intention to hit Evan, but then he remembered how big Evan was compared to him. So he hit Craig instead. The 2 boys beat Craig until he stopped moving. Then Evan shook Jake's hand and went over to the pond where he disposed of his clothes and weapon. Jake watched in silence, then he followed Evan to his house. There they created the story, where they parted ways with Craig around 4:30 p.m. It was Evan's idea to have a story to tell the police. He was completely prepared for all of the steps of the investigation, but he didn't expect to be arrested so soon. The police interrupted his killing spree. This was a tough story to hear from the mouth of a 14-year-old. Jake was a bit older, but he was still a kid. And imagine how Craig's parents felt when they heard the story of their son's death. Jake was offered a plea deal. If he would testify in court against Evan, he wouldn't be charged with first-degree murder. He'd only be charged with second-degree murder by complicity. So, even if he was being tried as an adult, Jake would only get a sentence of 8 years in prison. In April 2005, Jake appeared in court and made his full confession.
You solemnly swear or affirm to tell the truth under penalty of perjury.
When he finished, the judge gave him a sentence of 14 years, much longer than the one recommended by the prosecutors. The judge said that a 12-year-old perfectly understands what it means to hurt someone, and that Jake should have stopped it, or at least told someone about it, not cover his and Evan's tracks. Evan, on the other hand, showed zero remorse, and so did his defense team, who tried to pin the blame on Craig's father, Chuck. Yep. Even if Chuck proved he was out of town the day of Craig's murder, the lawyers tried to frame him for the brutal attack. When that theory failed, they moved on to Craig's child services, trying to have them testify against Lisa, Craig's mother. It's pretty outrageous that the killer tried to frame the victim's parents, don't you think? Needless to say, Craig's parents got very upset at Evan's parents, but the latter were determined to protect their son. So both couples started harassing each other until they got restraining orders both ways. When Lisa was cleared of all suspicion too, Evan's defense team started pointing their fingers at Cody Cook, a former schoolmate of the three boys. Cody said he actually witnessed the murder that fateful day. He was walking home when he heard screaming from the park, so he went over to check what was happening. But when he realized that his friend was being attacked, he hid in the bushes, afraid of falling victim to Evan and Jake as well. After the attack was over and the boys left, Cody ran over to Craig, but he realized it was too late. He didn't tell his parents about it at the time, but his mother noticed a change in his behavior over the next few days. Back in 2003, Evan's parents had presented a theory that perfectly matched Cody's testimony. They argued that after Craig fell from the tree and Evan left, someone else came in and killed Craig. So now they started going at Cody, saying he was actually the person who snooped in and took Craig's life that day. This delayed the trial for months, as the prosecution had to work hard to prove Cody's innocence. It wasn't until Jake's testimony in April 2005 that Evan could finally be convicted. Evan was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to 26 years in prison. However, Evan and his family continued fighting for his freedom and claiming he was innocent. In 2011, his sentence was overturned. His defense team claimed that his right to a public trial had been violated, as the judge restricted certain parts of him to the public. His lawyers were pushing for a retrial, but amidst all of this, Evan changed his mind. In 2014, he pled guilty to second-degree murder. He was sentenced to 20 years in prison. It's still unclear whether he's in prison or not. Some sources say he's due for parole in 2034, but others say he was actually released back in June 2020. You might say, well, at least Craig's family got some closure, now that both Jake and Evan are in prison. Unfortunately, this couldn't be further away from the truth. First of all, Lisa and Chuck have to live with the horrifying reality that their autistic son was brutally murdered by two 12-year-olds who pretended to be their friend. Second of all, Evan's family tried to frame them for the murder. And finally, the boys continued to complicate their lives. Well, this time, it was Jake who became a questionable character. After Evan was sent to prison, Jake wrote to Evan's mom in very poor grammar.
Jake wrote, I stabbed Craig Sorger. I planned the murder and I switched clothing with Evan at the crime scene. His bloody clothing are mine. And now a kid is going down for what I did.
What was Jake playing at? Was he feeling increasingly remorseful, or did he just want to stir the waters? Jake spent most of his prison sentence in solitary confinement. Remember how he was a shy boy with some unaddressed anger issues? Now, he was letting those issues out. He was constantly fighting, yelling, and causing trouble with other prisoners and the guards alike. Toward the end of his sentence, Jake completed an auto mechanic course and was put on work release. In 2016, 3 months before he was due to be released, Jake escaped the work facility and hitchhiked to Idaho, where he took a bus to Rapid City, South Dakota. As soon as he was off the bus, he was greeted by a group of federal marshals. He was taken back to Washington and sentenced to another 5 years in prison.
I spent a great deal of time in lockup, in solitary confinement, because of trouble that I got into. And there was a block of time where I spent 14 months in there. And then I got out, and then I went back into there and served another 9 months. So that's a good, like, 2.5 years that I spent pretty much by myself. And it was during that time that I kind of like started to educate myself.
Eventually, he ended up serving only 6 months. But during these months, Jake underwent another drastic turn in his personality. He became obsessed with the Bible, reading it more than once a month, cover to cover. Soon enough, he started declaring himself a born-again Christian. During this time in prison, Jake also started a relationship with Marissa, an old family friend whose dad was best friends with Jake's dad. She'd visited Jake throughout his sentence, and after a while, their friendship turned romantic. But Marissa had great influence over Jake. And here's where it gets weird. Marissa had come out as a lesbian to her parents back when she was 18, about a decade back. But she kept struggling with her gender identity, so when she turned 20, she started some hormone therapy to transition to male. That's when she started feeling depressed, overindulging in alcohol, and thinking of taking her life. She then detransitioned, and along the way, she discovered Jesus. Her views on the Bible aligned with Jake's. So in 2017, Jake was released and the two got married. Around this time, Jake also became an anti-abortion activist.
You see, love is a tangible thing. Love is not just something we say or just an emotion. Love is something that is tangible.
Yeah, it's not the same, Jake. When he's not arguing for capital punishment for people who choose to have abortions, Jake is ranting against the LGBT community. First, he blamed the community for what happened to his wife back when she was transitioning. Now he's blaming it for, well, all the wrong reasons. He's been caught several times shouting vile things at women in the street.
He wants attention. That's his goal. And that means is just a way to bring more attention to himself.
Indeed, it's truly worrying that he's free to do these sorts of things today, less than 20 years after murdering Craig Sorger. If Evan is out too, hopefully he's been able to turn his life around and not be spreading hatred. We can only hope that Craig's family is able to move on. But can you ever move on from a death like Craig's?
The real site where fascists organize and stuff is called Iron Merge, and then you also have Stormfront. And is that that's like a social media group? Yes. Okay. It's a whole website, and I know everything about that site and the people that are behind this.
This is 18-year-old Devin Arthurs. In 2017, he renounced his Nazi beliefs, converted to Islam, and then killed his 2 roommates for making fun of it. Then he claimed he was a hero, saving the world from 2 evil people who were planning to kill.
They're planning bombings and stuff like that on countless people. They're planning to kill civilian life.
If you think this is crazy, wait till you see the whole interrogation. Let's delve into the story of Devin Arthurs and try to understand his disturbing murder motive. Today's story begins in Tampa, Florida. Tampa is a major business center, but like many Florida cities, it's also home to splendid beaches, museums, theme parks, and lots of activities for the younger ones. But Devin Arthurs didn't seem to enjoy any of these. As a teen, he'd paired up with 3 other boys, Andrew Wunschuk, Jeremy Hillman, and Brandon Russell. Sadly, the only thing that united these 4 boys was their neo views. What's even stranger is none of the boys' families held these views. Jeremy's girlfriend Kiana said, Jeremy went through a lot of struggle in his life, and National Socialism offered him the rigidity he desired and offered him solutions for the things out of his control. So it's been really hard to try and tell his family, but yes, he did hold white supremacist beliefs and National Socialist beliefs. When Jeremy was 15, his mom found ultra right-wing conservative material on his computer. She confronted him about it and blocked his computer from accessing more hateful websites. But Jeremy found a loophole, and then he found a bunch of friends to share these distorted views with. Andrew felt he never fit in with any group his age. He never drank, used drugs, or partied. His dad, Walter, remembered Andrew was a very conservative guy. He looked at his generation and said, we're on the path to ruin. In November 2016, 6 months before turning 18, Andrew traveled to France and joined the French Foreign Legion, a force of volunteer soldiers from around the world to test his nerve with old-school soldiering. But his stint didn't even last a month. Walter said he faked a shoulder injury to escape service. Andrew's beliefs were a show-off. They made him feel powerful, but he wasn't a tough soldier or a far-right conservative at heart. When he came back from France, Andrew had toned it down with his views. He was kind of a different kid when he came back. He realized this stuff was not his future. And here's where it gets interesting. Andrew and Jeremy lived in Massachusetts. Devin and Brandon lived in Tampa in a 2-story condo with access to a fishing pond. The two pairs of friends met online in 2016 on a terrible website for US fascists. Devin and Brandon had founded their own club called Atomwaffen, German for the atomic bomb. Soon enough, they'd made Andrew and Jeremy members too. Then in 2017, Brandon started pressuring Jeremy to move in with them in Tampa. Jeremy was planning to join the military, but he was completely broke and unsure about his next moves. So he accepted Brandon's invitation, at least for the summer. However, Jeremy would never leave that house again. Andrew and Jeremy decided to move into the boys' Tampa home together. Through Atomwaffen, Jeremy and Andrew had become best buddies, and they thought it would be a cool summer to fish and live rent-free in a beautiful house. They also thought Devin and Brandon would be serious people. They'd advertised a great deal of maturity and integrity on that website, at least from their point of view. But when the two friends arrived in Tampa, they discovered 2 teenage boys who played video games all day. The whole neo-Nazi act was a toxic display of masculinity and power. It gave the boys a sense of belonging. All 4 of them were different kinds of social outcasts. Together, they felt strong and special. Jeremy's girlfriend commented, "Jeremy went down there expecting a break from the stress he was under in Massachusetts. As soon as he arrived in Florida, the stark difference between the promises made and the reality was apparent." Just days after his arrival, Andrew phoned his family. He was also disappointed. Andrew told his dad that he was the only one in the house cooking and cleaning. Also, Devin was making a big deal about his conversion to Islam. Wait, what?
Now, there were allegedly 4 so-called neo-Nazis living together in this particular place. And at one point, the suspect, who has been charged with first-degree murder, Devin Arthurs is his name, apparently had converted to Islam, even though he had sympathized with this neo-Nazi ideology. Now, after he had done so, naturally, his neo-Nazi friends were disrespecting his newfound faith.
As it turns out, all the boys were disrespecting each other on a daily basis. Just a quick observation, it's hard to live with strangers or people you barely know online. It's even harder for 4 irresponsible teens with warped views of the world to live together. They were acting like kids. Andrew and Jeremy were mocking Devin for playing video games all day and for wanting to convert to Islam. Devin and Brandon were mocking Andrew for hanging an American flag in his bedroom. He'd gotten the flag from an overseas deployment and was proud of it, but Devin and Brandon would pull it down from the wall and stomp on it just for a laugh. It was a neo-Nazi kids camp. On May 18th, Devin logged into his Atomwaffen website and picked a fight with other members about his new religious conversion. Needless to say, white supremacists aren't fans of Islam. Devin knew this, and he was looking for a conflict. The next day, he would shoot and kill Andrew and Jeremy, while Brandon was on National Guard duty. On May 19th, 2017, Devin pulled out his gun and repeatedly shot Andrew and Jeremy until they fell to their deaths, 2 weeks after they had arrived in Tampa. Then he ran into a smoke shop, still holding his gun, and held 3 people hostage until the police arrived. Finally, he surrendered. When he was arrested, he simply told the officer he had just killed his 2 roommates. His calm demeanor and matter-of-fact speaking was pretty shocking to the police, especially when they found out he was a freshly converted neo-Nazi.
Fortunately, most of the people that talk to me about this, they don't say stuff like that. So
they themselves were not.
For the record, my name is Kenny Necklinger. I'm a detective with Tampa Police. This is Gary Sandell, also detective with Tampa Police.
Before Kenny read Devin his Miranda rights, he wanted to make sure Devin wasn't under the influence of any drugs or medication. He also asked him if he had any history of mental illness, as this would come in handy later.
Do you or have you ever been diagnosed with any kind of mental illness or anything like that that might prevent you from having a conversation where you understand what I'm saying or understand what you're saying?
No, I don't. I've never been prescribed with that. But I wish I went to a hospital before this. I wish I had listened to my family and just I wish I had followed what they were recommending me to do and stuff like that.
What's that regarding?
Regarding like
me going over there and going to get help.
Yep, as it turns out, Devin's family had struggled with Devin's many issues in the past, and they had urged him to seek psychiatric help, or at least counseling. But Devin was far too gone to realize that he needed help. However, he remembered some discussions he'd had with his family.
Yeah, it was mainly over depression and stuff like that, and it was never anything to this severity. Yeah.
Were you taking any medication at all? You never got to that point.
Never got to that point.
Okay. All right.
Devin asked Kenny if he could speak to doctors when he got booked into jail. He knew something was wrong with him and he wanted to get help, but it was a minute too late for Andrew and Jeremy. Up to this point, you might think, okay, Devin changed his white supremacist beliefs and now he's trying to become a better person. But first of all, he'd just committed a double murder. And second of all, watch what he says when Kenny asks why he did this.
Adam Division is a terrorist organization. It's a neo-Nazi organization that I was a part of before I converted.
So what's it called?
Adam Division.
Okay.
And I remember my roommate Brandon. He's alive. The guy that was in the American uniform. I hope he gets his shit together. I hope he gets his life together. He's a good person. But the things that they were planning were horrible. They're planning bombings and stuff like that on countless people. They're planning to kill civilian life.
This was a shocking allegation. According to Devin, his 3 roommates were planning to plant bombs in public places and kill dozens of people. When he killed Jeremy and Andrew, he was doing the world a favor. Honestly, how narcissistic do you have to be to take the moral high ground after you've killed 2 people?
Well, were they specific in their plans?
Power lines, nuclear reactors, synagogues, things like that. And the reason why I mention this is because it's self-evident. You go into the place, there's a giant Azov Regiment flag that's in the background. Azov Regiment is an organization in Ukraine, which is an NS movement that crucifies people and has harmed a lot of people that came directly from there. These people were not good people, is what I'm trying to say.
Oh, really? Well, this was his and Brandon's house.
How did you end up at that apartment? How did you move in with them, and how did that go?
I'll explain. So I remember when I was 4. I'll just start from the beginning of these beliefs and stuff like that. So
that's fine.
When I was 14, I first started getting into these organizations and stuff like that.
When he was 17, Devin claimed he outgrew his racist beliefs and converted to Islam. But here's the dark side.
I'll be honest, I'm sympathetic with groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS and stuff like that.
So he jumped from one hateful ideology to another. His conversion was a way of saying, now I hate those other people. Either way, Devin was looking to do harm.
So that day I was watching videos of infants that were killed by American bombs.
Which was that today?
Yeah, and that's what was driving me crazy. Is that was getting me. And I was also seeing the posts that was being made in an encrypted chat by other members about how they want to kill blacks and how they want to kill
members of what? Which
the same organizations, or yeah.
Which organization is that?
Okay. So why was he living with Brandon, who was condoning these exact views?
And I was living there because I was living primarily with the guy in the American uniform, the Brandon. And he's a decent human being that can be reasoned with.
What exactly did you say?
They would say stuff like, I want to blow up refugee ships. They would say stuff like they want to go target blacks, like how Dylan Roof did. These people, they were not just innocent people.
Notice how Devin insists Brandon, Andrew, and Jeremy were the ones who were wrong, not him. But Kenny saw through the act, so he asked Devin if he had any evidence of the 3 being violent.
Have they ever done any bad things specifically that you know about? Maybe that you were a part of, that you weren't part of?
I was never a part. We never targeted anybody, but we had plans. We had guys in the American military that literally would go to bases and steal huge amounts of equipment. We're talking Kevlar, night vision, stuff like that, for the intent of criminal activity, i.e., targeting government structures, targeting people.
Devin calmly claimed that he and his former friends helped the Azov Regiment by hacking telecom networks held by the separatists.
So we hacked factories and we shut down electricity. I remember there was an article that a factory got shut down and a dozen people had died, like frozen to death, and I was horrified by that. I was absolutely mortified.
Because you were a part of that.
Yeah, I was mortified.
These claims were never verified. Were Devin and Brandon really implicated in that, or was he trying to feel important in front of the cop? Devin said Brandon had only rented that house a month and a half before the murders, so he hadn't been living with Brandon for that long either. However, Andrew and Jeremy had only been there for 2 weeks. The detective could sense they weren't necessarily responsible for any murderous plans the other two might have had.
How long had you known these guys?
I've known these guys almost for a year.
Okay. Where'd you first meet them?
Met them online first. And then I went up to Boston with Brandon and I hung out with them for...
You met Brandon online as well?
Yeah.
When Kenny asked Devin about the website the two met through, Devin said it had since been deleted for its extremist views. Then he went on a rant about several such websites.
The real site where fascists organize and stuff is called Iron Merge, and then you also have Stormfront. And
is that that's like a social media group for those?
Okay. Iron Merge, it's a whole website. And I'm like, I know everything about that site and the people that are behind this shit.
Once again, he put himself in a position of power and importance. He knew everything about the site and its people. Devin saw himself as a helper, a vigilante hero, helping the detectives put an end to neo-Nazis in America.
And these people were basically, if you're familiar with the Order of Bob Matthews or whatever, he was a guy that killed like a bunch of federal agents and stuff like that. Like that's basically who they venerate. And these people, they have no human empathy like we do.
Like we do? Who? Devin and the detectives? It's almost funny if there weren't fascists and murders involved.
I wish that if I could go back and do something over, I would sign myself into a hospital to work about my anger issues and my rational thinking skills, which I don't think is at par of like.
But I think this goes beyond anger issues. I think it's something a little deeper for you. I think it's more of it's a passion that you're passionate about doing good for people.
Kenny fed his inflated ego to help him get to the bottom of the story.
Forgive me, I'm just trying to. You're educating me in this whole process. So yeah. I'm going to ask questions as a student sitting here. You believe, you have a faith, you said. What is your faith?
I'm a Muslim.
Okay. Does that coincide with this organization you're part of?
No, not at all.
So how long have you been a Muslim?
I've been a Muslim since June of 2016.
Okay, so fairly recently.
Yeah.
Have you still maintained a part in this organization, or is that about when your ties to this organization were cut?
My main ties to this organization is like, I was a part of it out of necessity. I needed a place to stay away from my family. Not that there's anything wrong with that. I should have lived with them. I was just trying to get out of the house and stuff like that.
That didn't make much sense. If he'd been a Muslim for 11 months, why would he have moved in with Brandon, whom he despised so much, a month and a half prior to the murders? There are so many ways one could get away from their family. Moving in with a neo-Nazi who hates your belief should be at the bottom of that list.
That's why I was a part of it. It was mainly to try to get people away from this shit and try to basically.
That's when you first joined up?
No, this is when, no, I was already part of it when I converted. I just when I converted, I was like, I got it. While I'm in here, I can't just leave it. If I left it, then I'd probably be killed or something like that.
Devin alternated between two reasons for his staying with Brandon. On the one hand, he claimed he would have been killed if he left. However, he was the only one killing. On the other hand, he claimed he was just trying to help other people convert to more peaceful beliefs. Again, Devin saw himself as a moral vigilante hero. But Kenny was one step ahead. When the officers at the smoke shop arrested Devin, he told them he killed his roommates because they were making fun of his newfound faith. Watch how Kenny reduces his motives to ashes with one simple question.
But you made no secret about it to even Brandon, I imagine, of your faith, right? They knew what you were about.
Yeah.
And they still tolerated you.
Yeah, they still tolerated. Yeah, they did barely.
There are two big mistakes on Devin's behalf here. One, his claim that he killed Andrew and Jeremy for disrespecting his belief is invalid. He just said they tolerated his faith. Two, the moral side of his murder motive has just been invalidated too. Devin claimed his roommates hated people of his faith and planned to kill such people, but he just said they continued to let him live there, including Brandon, whom he was painting as the leader of Adam Waffen.
Brandon's literally somebody that has the knowledge to build a nuclear bomb.
Do you know if these materials are inside that condo right now?
No, there's no nuclear materials. Actually, there is. Yes, there is nuclear materials in that garage. There is some nuclear materials.
Okay, what's in that garage? That
in that garage is HMTD. Yeah, those explosives. Yeah, some ammonium nitrate, I believe, and I know that there's some radiated materials that he was able to bring in through the Bahamas. And because he's a Bahamian citizen, he was able to bring it in.
This is what the police found in Brandon's garage. In the condo's garage, they say bomb squad technicians found volatile explosive material stored in a cooler near homemade detonator components and several pounds of ammonium nitrate. Two sources of radiation also were detected on the premises, they say. When Devin led the police to the condo, Brandon was outside dressed in military uniform and crying on the front steps. Brandon was not prepared to find a crime scene at his place, but clearly he was prepared for planting bombs if he wanted to. A federal judge ordered him detained as he agreed Brandon was a risk to the public. However, there was no further evidence that Brandon was indeed planning to use his explosives. When investigators questioned him about the explosives they found at the condo, he said he had joined an engineering club in college and used the material to boost homemade rockets. This might sound like a bunch of lies, but it turns out every one of Brandon's friends knew him as a science nerd. In a YouTube video with 3.6 million views since its posting in March, he helped Kevin Colher, the host of The Backyard Scientist, use an electrical charge to blow a hole in a slab of raw meat. As soon as the news of the double homicide broke out, the four boys' families were shocked and heartbroken. Jeremy and Andrew's families spoke out, insisting their sons were on the right track. Their views had waned out with time, and they were not living with Devin and Brandon with the intent to kill. They were just looking for a cool summer in Florida. Their families dismiss his claims as the self-serving rantings of a sociopath who initially told investigators that he killed his friends for teasing him about his recent conversion to Islam. Even Brandon's Adam Waffen bestie said Devin lied about their seriousness. We're not here to bomb the US government. That's absolutely ridiculous. Everyone but Devin had the same view. These were a bunch of awkward teenage boys with social exclusion issues who took to the internet to rant about hatred and feel powerful for once in their lives. However, none of them had a history of violence or a criminal record, not even a history of physical altercations at school. It was all in their heads. That is not to say that hate speeches don't do harm, especially when they can influence thousands of others online to take the same disgusting ideologies. However, according to Devin, the boys were involved in the worst possible organizations on Earth.
You know, it's a real deal. They have a real intent. I need you both to pretty much swear me this is not going to get released. I can't give certain information, but that's on.
Yeah. He is in the middle of a grand conspiracy theory, and he can only help the detectives bring those evil people down.
I'm telling you something that I wanted. I'm telling you stuff that the FBI should also be hearing.
Devin had read about some terrible things done by white supremacists throughout history. Then he attributed those things to his three roommates to justify his hatred toward them. But as far as Kenny was concerned, he needed hard evidence to prosecute Brandon or prove Andrew or Jeremy were at fault in any way. So he kept pressing Devin for any relevant information about the three young men.
Anything else in that apartment or that condo that you think we should be made aware of, especially if we're going to go in there and do any kind of searching or investigation? What's in there that we need to be initially made aware of? You mentioned bombs, you mentioned things in the garage, or at least
the things in the garage are the bombs, pretty much, like explosive materials.
That's all Devin had against his three friends, Brandon's explosive materials. And he insisted Brandon was planning on bombing public places, even when the cops suggested the materials could be for other activities.
Yeah, nothing's been constructed yet, but this is clearly stuff that is lined up for the explosives there.
That's the purpose of those items?
Yeah, so that's the entire purpose of it.
You guys don't build model rockets and go out in the back and shoot them off.
But remember what what Brandon's friends had said. That was exactly what he was doing with the explosives. Devin's lies and hypocrisy came out in another way toward the end of the interrogation. Remember how he said he was only sticking around with his group in hope of changing their beliefs? Now he gave a greater reason.
Why did you remain amongst these guys? Now, it begs the question as to why they tolerated you there, but why did you tolerate being around them?
Because I was an idiot, and I was just mainly thinking along the lines of, oh wow, I get to stay here in this really nice apartment, in this really nice condo, while paying a rent of like $120 a month, you know, and I have internet and stuff like that, so I might as well just, you know, stay here.
Yeah, that sounds like a more honest reason. And if Devin was such a righteous, anti-racist now, how come he was living with a bunch of people who, according to him, were planning to bomb refugee camps?
How do you think you would have continued to tolerate this or handle this? Do you think you would have been driven out at some point?
I think that I would have definitely been driven out. Like today, I was at my boiling point. I was close to just messaging. I was literally, I had the Skype open, and I was like about to type like, dude, I'm packing my shit back to Orlando. You know, you guys can go f off, pretty much. And I was gonna then contact the FBI or some local police to go like that.
It's simply crazy that Devin speaks so calmly about his moral high ground, his hero personality, and his plans to stop his friend's neo-Nazi party when he was the only one with 2 murders on his record. He is so delusional, it hurts.
Well, do you think that whatever plan that you guys were going to carry out, specifically the lines down on Alligator Alley, do you think someone else is Brandon going to continue? Do you think it's still going to happen?
Oh, absolutely. Well, no, it's not going to happen. Brandon's entire condo is now police quarantine. He doesn't have access to the materials. He doesn't have access to the manpower.
Devin really believed he helped put an end to Brandon's evil plans by killing Andrew and Jeremy. Devin didn't resist arrest or harsh punishment. His primary concern was seeing a doctor in prison.
Very, very concerned that when I go to the next place, I'd much rather, if I can, go to a hospital or immediately see the doctors when I go to the jail. I think that I would much rather be at a mental hospital where I should have been, because my family's been telling me, like, you know, go to a hospital, try to get this stuff sorted and stuff like that. And I'd very much like to go do that.
Wait a minute. Mental hospital, he says. Was Devin trying to manipulate the detective into declaring him criminally insane and get a lighter sentence? If that was what he was doing, then Devin didn't know the law. It's not the investigators who do that, it's psychiatrists, and the decision is taken in court, not in the interrogation room. Devin ended the interrogation by asking Kenny to put him in contact with the FBI so that he could save more lives.
I think that it would open some eyes to a much bigger thing than what happened today. And I think that could definitely, basically save a lot of lives overall.
But as Kenny asked about the evidence he had, Devin only dug his own hole deeper. He confessed that he still had all the usernames for the neo-Nazi websites he'd described earlier. How could this be if he'd been a converted Muslim for 11 months? And if he was so willing to meet with the FBI now, why didn't he call them before instead of killing his roommates? Devin Arthurs was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder, 3 counts of armed kidnapping, and 2 counts of aggravated assault. But initially, he was deemed incapable of standing trial. He was diagnosed with schizophrenia and autism, among a long list of disorders.
The court says Arthurs suffers from schizoaffective disorder. He's also been diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder.
For 3 years, Devin spent time in the Developmental Disabilities Defendant Program, and beginning in 2020, he underwent competency restoration treatment. Brandon Russell was not involved in the murders, nor was he ever accused of planning any violent acts, but he later pleaded guilty to federal charges of possessing explosives. He was sentenced to 5 years in prison and has since been released. Meanwhile, Devin is drifting in and out of jails, courtrooms, and hospitals. Attorneys, psychiatrists, and judges have yet to find a common conclusion and bring his case to trial. Either way, it's unlikely Devin will ever be free again. The only thing he has to say for himself: I prevented the deaths of a lot of people because they wanted to build a fourth Reich. It's truly heartbreaking how little he understands about what he did. In his warped mind, he was the hero in this disturbing tale. He might never express remorse and give the victims' families the closure they need. Thanks for watching, you guys. What do you think about this crazy case? Do you know of any other similar interrogations? Let me know in the comments, and before you leave, don't forget to like, subscribe, and click that bell button. See you next time, and stay safe.